They were
Wow.
clearly, they were clearly saying that the chief gets to control everything that happens at the service. We don't want to hear from officers. The chief's going to maintain internal discipline, all that stuff. There is so much trust and power given to a police chief. But in this
Mm-hmm.
case, I knew that the decisions being made about these officers, when to investigate, when to charge, those all have to be approved by the chief. So I knew that my issue was with the chief and him abusing his power to charge some and not charge other officers, which I
Right.
don't believe he has the legal right to do.
Good afternoon or evening or morning, I guess, anytime you're watching this, for a new episode of Dialogue Over Division. And today I have with me Kelly Donovan. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with Kelly because there's been lots of discussions about the criminal justice system and things going on in Canada. And Kelly is a former police officer that brought forward concerns, and she's written a book called Police Line Do Not Cross. And I'm very interested to hear about her story, what led her to write this book. And without putting words in her mouth, I'm going to turn over the mic to Kelly. So if you could please give us all an introduction of
Sure.
yourself.
Well, thanks so much, Eva, for having me on the program. Because, like I said before we started recording, I just think that there needs to be much more dialogue from divided sides of every issue, because that's the only way we're going to understand each other's perspective. So I'm hoping some of your listeners will be a little bit shocked by what they hear today. Maybe some of them will not be surprised if they've had any experience in the policing world. But basically, my story, if I want to go back to the start, would just be that I was, like every other person, working a full-time job, starting a family. I hadn't really had any experience with police at that time in my life, but I was in a relationship that turned abusive, and I requested the assistance of the police. Only my partner at the time was a police officer. So that was the first time, when you don't access police services a lot, you don't really know what to expect. But that first time that I went to the police for assistance, I was really shocked and blown away by how they handled the whole situation. Because he was a police officer, it just didn't seem like they were treating him the same as they would a member of the public. And then we had another incident. We had two incidents where the police were involved. And after the second one, I was really uncomfortable with how they were handling a criminal investigation. I went through Freedom of Information, got all the notes for all the officers, and that's
Before
when
we
I
can, before we go on, can you just say what it was that really surprised and shocked you? Because you did say that a couple times with right from the get-go. What was it that you're like, how is this even happening?
It was like finding ways to excuse his behavior. Oh, he was just trying to do this. Or, in the end, I found out in all the reports that I was actually, the officers were putting in their notes that I was suffering from postpartum depression because I had had a baby 8 months prior. I mean, my mental health was not anything we discussed. It wasn't anything I was struggling with. I hadn't sought medical treatment. So, they were conveniently making the narrative suit the outcome that they wanted, which was that nothing would happen. Um, but I was really surprised that, like, in light of evidence, they could kind of come to whatever conclusion they wanted, and they could make it clear in their notes that, that it was the way they wanted it to be, that sort of thing. They could control the whole outcome. But
Uh-huh.
I was mostly shocked because at that point in time, Canada had just put in place our mandatory charge policies for domestic violence. We were just starting to realize how problematic domestic violence had become in Canada. And we were taking the ability out of the hands of a victim to, decide when they want the abuser to be charged or not charged. So I knew that, if there were grounds to lay a charge here, that he should be getting arrested. But it just didn't seem like they were investigating it the way I knew that domestic violence should be investigated. I mean, for
Right.
instance, the first incident, they didn't even have me on video for the statement. They had me write out a statement, which later on down the road, I learned that that's not something they would do if a member of the public came in to report domestic abuse. So it was little things like that that they could do differently because because it involved a member. But at that point in time, like I said, I wasn't a police officer then. I was working at the bank. But that whole experience really shifted my core beliefs. Like, I started thinking, there need to be more good people in policing, because we can't have police that are favoring their buddies when, a call comes in. And I had known about a couple other cases where there had been accusations of domestic violence in a home involving a police officer where it was not handled properly. So I was starting to believe like this is some kind of a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. But I knew, as a civilian, if I want to complain about this, it's only going to be that particular service that gets looked at and that particular officer. And I thought that's not going to do anything for the systemic nature of the problem. So at that point, I decided to become a police officer, because I was also, a single mom, and I knew that policing could be a lucrative profession. I was well suited for it. I had leadership qualities. I was, connected in my community. I was athletic. So, after that relationship broke down, I just decided that this was a good move for me, and that maybe from the inside I could start to make differences that way towards the systemic problem. But then, 4 or 5 years on the job, it didn't take long for me to start to see that the same thing was happening at the service I worked for. And it was, it started with little things that I would hear, and then I would do a little digging on my own, making phone calls to people, trying to get more information, looking at evidence myself. But in the end, I had uncovered these 4 different cases at Waterloo Regional Police, which is where I was working. And in the 4 cases, they were just so inconsistent with how they handled it. So 4 allegations came forward about members that work for the police service, and 2 of them, there were charges laid, but the charges seemed weak. Like there were 2 cases where, it was a stretch to even arrest, but then they would blow up the investigation into this like homicide scale investigation where they were flying investigators like out to Vancouver to take a witness statement, things like that you would only do if it was like a murder charge or, attempted murder. They were doing this against their own people. And then there'd be 2 other people with allegations made against them that were worse, but they wouldn't be charged, and in some cases not even investigated. So I had these 4 examples where I knew that we were doing it completely inconsistent. We weren't following the mandatory charge policies established by the government. And I knew that with domestic violence being such a problem, this had to change. So, my actual story begins in around 2016. I had asked around at work to try to find out like why nobody has really made an issue of this before. Yeah. I went to my union, and at a meeting on the public microphone, I said, like, I'm only 5 years on the job here, and I already can't stand back and watch while this is happening. Like, how is everyone else here okay with it? And the answer I really just got from all the experienced officers was like, it's always been this way. It's never going to change. Like cops do, they handle these things internally the way they want, and we just have to accept it. So there was this level of moral acceptance that I couldn't achieve, right? I just couldn't silence that feeling in my gut. Like what we're doing is wrong. And we don't know how many, people are on the job going home and abusing their families, right? Because we don't handle those investigations properly. There's probably abusers on the job, right, that are getting away with it. So what I decided to do, because I didn't have the support of my union, I looked at all the oversight bodies that the province had at the time, and there was no way for me to complain. Like at the time, our provincial law actually prohibited me from complaining to the oversight body. There was a section in the law that prohibited a current police officer from complaining against their own service. It was ridiculous. But at the end of the day, I knew like this problem has to be exposed.
And what would have been the consequences? Like, what are they actually saying that you can't make a complaint against your own body?
Well, this was just the way that the law was written. So recently we've had a complete rewrite of the policing legislation in Ontario. But before, it was the section that addressed police misconduct. And it says, if you witness misconduct or of misconduct, you can make a complaint to the independent oversight body. But there was an exception. There was a section 2 that said, hold on, these people can't complain. And in that list was police officer at the same service. They were clearly, they were clearly saying that the chief gets to control everything that happens at the service. We don't want to hear from officers. The chief's going to maintain internal discipline, all that stuff. There is so much trust and power given to a police chief. But in this case, I knew that the decisions being made about these officers, when to investigate, when to charge, those all have to be approved by the chief. So I knew that my issue was with the chief and him abusing his power to charge some and not charge other officers, which I don't believe he has the legal right to do. So I I had the courage at the time, I don't know how, in 2016 to go to my police service board. I was either courageous or I was naive and stupid, but your
Either
listeners
way.
can decide. But 2016 in May, I knew I had to get it off my chest because at that point, I had actually been becoming mentally ill because of what I was dealing with internally. Like I know now, now that I've been in therapy for PTSD, I know that it was a moral injury I was experiencing. This institution that I believed was fundamentally, ethical. I knew there were problems. Like I wasn't that naive. I knew that there were
Yeah.
bad apples. I knew there's a process to weed them out. But in this case, I saw that at the highest level of authority, we're still making unethical decisions. And that really did shock me. Like it did shock me to my core to know that we were allowing this to happen. And out of 750 sworn officers, I was the only one that thought it was problematic and wanted to do something about it. So
Yeah.
I went through a lot in that time. But in the end, I knew I had to do something about it. I couldn't just swallow it like everyone else and put my head down and go back to work. So I went to a board meeting and I sat at the table where all the board members were, and I started off by telling them, when you hired me, you obviously did so because you knew I had integrity, you knew I was an honest individual. But, now that I'm here and I see the way things are run, I have a real problem with it. And I gave them enough detail I believe they were actually going to look into the things that I told them and perhaps, question the chief or, maybe they'd want to meet with me to go over some things in more detail. But I spoke for 10 minutes and at the end of the meeting, they thanked me, but they didn't have any questions. And I felt, I felt like a 2-ton weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But I did not expect what happened next. So I did that, delegation.
Yeah, so you went to the board to present all of these things. That's like all of the issues, and your complaint was against the chief mainly. Is that right?
Yeah, and I was, I didn't access any information through the computers at work. Like I had not done anything wrong. I had done my own inquiries outside of work. And I made sure that I saw enough evidence to know that what I was saying was truthful.
Yeah.
There were cases where, there were 2 very public cases. So I would discuss those cases more because they were already in the media. There were 2 cases that weren't public, so I didn't mention any names. I strictly just spoke about instances where allegations were made. So I was trying to be careful, but I also knew that this was a matter of public interest and they had to pay attention and do something about it. So I didn't, I knew I was doing the right thing. I didn't feel like I was doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
But it was about a week later that I was pulled out of, I was a use of force trainer at the time, but they took me out of training and I had to go sit in internal affairs and be presented all this paperwork. And it's still like I was in so much shock to think like they had the nerve to do this to me, but they just kept throwing paperwork at me. The first one was a chief's directive right away. It said the chief is now prohibiting you from training any active members. You're relegated to administrative duties. I was put under investigation for 8 misconduct charges at the time. And he actually put me on a strict no contact order with members of the board. Like it was very clear that like you are now going to shut up. You're not going to talk to the board anymore. We're going to put you in the basement at headquarters and see how long you last. And they wanted to do this misconduct investigation. And at that point, like I was honestly so shocked that the chief would take such outright retaliation against me, right? He can't deny, like his name is on these papers, right? He signed them. So it was like, I cannot believe that instead of looking into what I told you, you're just going to attack the messenger. So for the next few months, that they said that they did internal reviews of some of the issues I raised, but in one case,
And who does the internal review?
it's usually someone in like internal affairs.
So it's a bit separate from your department and the chief. So
no, this was pretty internal.
Okay. Oh, so it still is. So he brings these allegations of misconduct, the chief, and
against him.
Yes.
Yeah, against
no
him.
Conflict of interest there.
Right. He'll ask someone else that works under him that is subordinate to him. Will you look into this? Right. Will you look into this?
Yeah, so that was the question. So it's somebody subordinate to him to look into the investigation of him. Okay.
Yeah. And there was one, so out of all the issues I raised, in one case, they did bring in York Regional Police to do an independent review. There's no such thing, as you probably know. So another police service did come in to look at one of the issues. And I had all my hope on that one. I thought this is going to be it because they're going to listen to what I have to say. They're going to look into it. They're going to see that everything's not right. And that was a total, it was like, I did an interview. Because I have all the interview notes and I have the recording now. I raised about 13 very valid issues I had with the way the investigators handled the case. And she looked into one of the 13, and the one she looked into proved that I was right. So she stopped looking into the things I told her. And then she wrapped up her investigation and said that Waterloo did everything fine. They did everything great without investigating anything I told her. So that's what they do, right? When they bring in another police service to do an independent review, it really depends.
Their track.
Right. It depends on what the connection is between that chief and this chief, because if they're, as you know, like every province has an association of chiefs of police. There's a Canadian Association Chiefs of Police. It's almost a fraternity, right? When you become a chief, it's like you get the ring and you become a member of the fraternity and you go to these conferences. You're all very, very close. So when a friend asks a friend, hey, come on in, I need your help. We need to review this investigation. Like, we really want to prove that Donovan was lying. Well, that's what they did, right? They gave them what they asked for. So the report says, nothing she said had any merit. Oh, except this one thing she told us, but they didn't look into the other 12. So I kind of got the sense after all these reviews were going on that this was it, right? Like I had done what I did for nothing. They're not really going to look into what I told them. My career is now going to be controlled by the person I was trying to report. And I tried to complain. I did my whole workplace harassment complaint. I went to the Human Rights Tribunal. I went everywhere I could. I was even emailing Justin Trudeau, Kathleen Wynne at the time. I tried the Ontario Ombudsman. I went everywhere I could, but I just got stonewalled everywhere.
And so, like, for example, the Human Rights Commission, what was it that they said and determined?
In a case like this, what they do is because I filed my complaint, Waterloo said, well, hold on, we're going after her for misconduct. We want to do that first.
Right.
Because if their argument was if she really did commit misconduct, well, then maybe there's nothing to her complaint. So but my complaint was that their misconduct investigation was harassment and discriminatory, right? I was complaining that like I hadn't done anything wrong, but they're coming after me like this. So my whole complaint got put on hold. They gave them 6 months because in Ontario, that's all you have to complete a misconduct investigation. So if they were going to charge me, they have to say they're going to charge me within 6 months.
Right.
Well, 6 months came and went, and I filed to reopen my case at the Human Rights Tribunal, and then they argued again, well, we need more time. We're still investigating her. And the Human Rights Tribunal allowed them more time. So that I knew it was just going to drag on and drag on. Eventually, my health was getting so poor at the time. Like I had actually experienced a traumatic incident when I was a recruit at the police college, and that started to metastasize into PTSD around 2015. So in the background to all this, I was already dealing with PTSD, but I didn't really know it at the time because those symptoms tend to be, it can come on very slow. It starts off with just depression, some anxiety, then you start to have the flashbacks, you start to have the nightmares. This was all happening all at the same time. But then after my delegation and after all the moral injury piled on, I couldn't do it anymore. Like, and I'm somebody with an extremely high stress tolerance. I've always been really good in stressful situations. But I reached a point in February 2017 where my body took over. And I know now that that's what happens, right? You can only handle so much stress as a human being. And then my body just started shutting down. So I had 1 week where I had 4 panic attacks in 1 week. And I had never had a panic attack before. I didn't even know what they were. So I thought I was having a heart attack the first time and went to the hospital. But so I just knew, like, as time went on, when all this was happening, I had 3 kids at home to support. I was still a single mom. And I knew, like, I'm not going to survive this ordeal unless I get out of this, right? Like, because I knew as soon as I went off sick, they basically put everything on hold. So they were basically saying, when you're healthy enough to come back, we're going to resume all this misconduct investigation. So I knew, like, what am I really going back to? And then right around the time that I was contemplating all this, Waterloo had a $167 million class action lawsuit launched against them by all the women of the service, past and current women. And it was, systemic sexual harassment, gender discrimination, sexual assault. And I had an opportunity to be part of the class action. So instead, I pretty much used the class action as a means to resign on my terms. And I just told them, if you don't agree to my terms, I'll just continue to get paid, and I'll join the class action. So I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I very carefully negotiated a resignation I could live with. And I left and I started my own business, and I really wanted to be the change that I wanted to see in the world. I was offering whistleblower programs to corporations. And it was a slow start, but the biggest part was that when I first resigned, everybody was interested in my story because it was one of the first times that a police officer had publicly spoken out and immediately faced retaliation, right? Without my claims being properly investigated, I just became the bad guy. So I was invited to a lot of conferences to share my story about what had happened. I was in the media quite a bit initially. And I even got to speak to Justice Michael Tulloch, who was doing the independent police oversight review in Ontario. So he was looking at the efficacy of our oversight bodies and looking at how they could improve. And when I went to one of his public sessions and told him my story, like, his eyes just lit up, because he had no idea that that was happening in our police services. That, first of all, that officers were prohibited from complaining. Like, but, when I actually pointed that out to him, he was blown away. Like, why would we not let police complain? Because they're the ones seeing what goes on inside, right? So there was that. And then he also recognized that police need whistleblower protection. So he put out his report in 2017, early 2017. So before I resigned, I got to see that my story had already affected some change, right? His was just a report, but I knew he's recognizing whistleblower protection in his report. And then Ontario, as I said, was in the process of rewriting their laws. So, about 6 months after I resigned, I was invited to speak at the Ontario legislature. And again, I shared my story of what happened to me. And again, it made a difference. So they were actually changing laws. They were now not only allowing a police officer to report misconduct, but they were saying you have a duty to report it, which should have been the case all along. But now it was legislated. And they were providing some element of whistleblower protection. So it wasn't as clean cut as I wanted it to be. But they were saying, if you make a complaint and then someone takes reprisal against you, that's an additional offense. You can complain about that. We'll look into that. So they were recognizing that my story had merit. And at that point, I really felt like this is why I did what I did. I've accomplished at least that. I've allowed other officers to complain, and now they're going to be protected. And that's really where my story should have ended. And I wouldn't be on your show today, right? It would just be, I had a job once, I left, I made a difference in the world. But Waterloo was so uptight about all the progress I had made that they brought a case against me at the Human Rights Tribunal, alleging that every time I speak about my experience working for them, I'm breaching my resignation agreement, the one that I carefully negotiated to make sure I'd be able to speak at the end of the day. Right. And so that they filed that case.
And they brought that to the Human Rights Commission?
Yes, because there's
their lawyer.
Yeah. There's a section, well, we'll get to that. But there's a section in the Ontario Human Rights Code that says if a previous case had been settled and then that settlement gets breached, you can bring a case to the tribunal. So that's what they were alleging. They were alleging that I did have a previous case. It was settled, and now I'm breaching the terms.
A case before the Human Rights Commission.
The one that I had that was deferred, that wasn't even heard.
You brought wasn't settled at the Human Rights Commission. Again, who was their lawyer? Just kidding.
So that was that was 2018. So I can't even get into the detail of what's happened since then because it's so long and it's so convoluted. But the other thing they did before they brought their case against me, and I think this is why they brought their case against me, they had done a couple things that I believed were actually breaches of the resignation agreement. The one that really bothered me the most and, again, kind of like injured me mentally after resigning, they were still hurting me. But what it was I had made sure that I had a WSIB claim, which is like your workplace safety in British Columbia. Yep. I had a claim in place when I resigned, but the only thing I wanted was I knew that I wouldn't be eligible. Well, I was told I wouldn't be eligible to continue to get my salary. I just wanted to make sure they were still going to pay for my care. So I made sure that, I'm resigning, but does my psychology care and my medication still get paid for by WSIB? They said, yeah, as long as you have a claim, that'll be paid for. So I made sure that beyond resignation, they wouldn't be able to mess with that, right? Because I knew that if I'm giving up all my benefits, all my salary, I need to make sure that I can maintain my health for the sake of my kids. So part of that was a big point for me resigning, was I still want to get that care. Well, about 6 months after resigning, right around the time I was advocating at the Ontario legislature, they filed an appeal of my WSIB claim. They wanted to eliminate the only care I was getting. And they knew, like, it's all in my, all this stuff to do with this traumatic incident at the police college was all in my personnel file. They knew that I was struggling with psychological injuries, but they still filed that against me. So I was at risk of losing the only medical care I was getting. But to me, it sent a different message to me. The message was like, we're going to do whatever we have to do to get you to stop talking. And if this works, then you'll disappear, right? Maybe you'll kill yourself. Maybe you'll just give up because you can't do it anymore or whatever. That was when I first started to realize that, like, they're out for blood. Like, they actually want to eliminate the only thing that's keeping me alive right now. So that was step one. I decided to file a very simple statement of claim against them for breach of contract for what they did. And then it was 51 days after I filed my statement of claim that they brought their case against me. So right away, I alleged that their case was only brought out of retaliation, that it was an abusive process because there was nothing in the contract preventing me from speaking. They still haven't been able to say what section of my resignation agreement I'm actually violating. So they've based their case on the premise that, well, the intent of the agreement was that you wouldn't speak about your experiences. Well, and I have evidence to prove that the intent was very clear. My intentions from day one were very clear, and they were confirmed, and it's all in writing. The evidence is there. I've presented the evidence to the Human Rights Tribunal, but it's 6 years later, and I'm still defending myself against this claim that is, it's in limbo. I mean, the delays at our tribunals, but in Ontario, it's ridiculous. Like 6 years in, and we haven't had a hearing. So I'm just under this cloud, right? It's following me everywhere. But the thing with them is, like, so they filed this case against me. It was a booklet about this thick, right? It had everything in there that I had ever done publicly, everything from my business website. They were claiming that I was profiting off my experience working for them, and I should pay them in proportion to what I'm earning with my business, which, when you're starting a business, you're not earning anything. So it was laughable. But this went on, so we did this battle in court. I've represented myself through everything. I've gone up to the Court of Appeal of Ontario. I was successful the first time. And then we talk about lawyers, but I won't get into that. But after my victory at the Court of Appeal, they went back and reopened the motion that I had overturned. Tell me if you've ever heard of that happening, because I couldn't find one case in all of our Canadian legal information portal where that was allowed. But in my case, it was allowed. So the motion had been overturned. They went back and said, well, we think that the judge forgot to decide a part of our motion. We want it revisited. And they were allowed to do that. So that reopened everything again. We went back to the Court of Appeal. I lost the second time. And now I've been forced. The Court of Appeal has said to me that all these issues between my employer and me are matters that should be handled by a labor arbitrator. But, when you have a union that doesn't support you, which is what I have in my case, I'm now fighting my union in a duty of fair representation. So essentially the last 7 years have been me trying to hold them accountable, and the system that's in place to allow me access to justice just keeps denying me access. They just keep putting up more hoops, and I keep jumping through every hoop they put up for me. But it's getting to the point where it's like I do the homework. I go through Freedom of Information. I know that as of now, they've spent over $700,000 on this lawyer. So when you talk about lawyers, he's making a living just working for Waterloo in this case, because he's also representing Waterloo against another female officer that's fighting them, Angelina Rivers. But it's just insane. At this point, we could be up to 750,000. Maybe we're getting close to 800,000. I don't think there's any end in sight. I think at some point we will reach $1 million. That's when I'll know that my voice is worth $1 million. But when you look at when you can stand back and look at the big picture and see that in 7 years, like I said to you, my story should have ended in 2018 when my experience was affecting positive changes to the laws. That was it for me. That was all I wanted.
Yeah.
But then they couldn't let it go, right? They just needed to do everything in their power to try to shut me up. And that's why they're still spending money. They're still coming after me. So, even when I thought that things were dwindling down, they renewed their case against me. They filed an amendment in December 2022, and all it did was update everything I had done for the previous 4 years. So they have me under full surveillance. This podcast will become Exhibit X in the next amendment that they file. Yeah,
High
hello.
court.
Because there's nothing preventing me from speaking. When I resigned, I knew what the contract said. I had legal advice. I'm good to go. I knew what I was allowed to say, what I wasn't allowed to say, and I've been acting lawfully the entire time.
Yeah. Well, just so you know, I think your voice is well over $1 million already, because that's just for the legal external ones. And the amount, like you just said, that they're utilizing to keep tabs on you, investigate you, watch this podcast, that's probably actually double what they've used on lawyers. So there's that consideration as well. So much to talk about, so incredibly interesting. And, maybe just for a second, I want to, like, there's so many things you said that were so positive, and I just loved hearing, like, be the change you want to be. I couldn't accept the moral acceptance, because one of my biggest frustrations, and I just had a offline conversation about this, is everything is broken. I'm so tired of it. And then you hear your story, and it's, life isn't easy, nor is democracy, nor are these systems. They get big and they get broken. And I think we want a magic wand to fix everything. And that's what I think that leads to a lot of the problems, because a lot has to do, you also said, there's nothing we can do to change it. I think you almost started with that with when you brought it up originally.
Yeah.
And all of this coming together, you're not giving up. Maybe let's just stop there for a second and take it a different way. Why aren't you giving up?
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, I've had several times where I felt like I could not go on, like that hopeless, I can't do this anymore. I just cannot, because of my health, because of my family, whatever. I think I was very fortunate to meet my now husband in 2018. So right when before all this stuff started happening is when I met him. But then when all this stuff started happening, like, I didn't have that rock hard support until I met him. But then when I started going through all those really rough times, I did have that support. And that was kind of the first time in my life that I had someone I could 100% depend on. And, it's for everything, for just that reminder every day to remind me that this fight's bigger than you, right? You're not just fighting for you, you're fighting the system to show that the system is broken, and you're making changes to the system, and you have to keep going. So I think it's, and I do get random emails and text messages from people that just say to me, like, I'm following your story, keep going, it's phenomenal, keep doing what you're doing, it has to be heard. So I guess that's why I do it, because I want my kids to see too that, like, things are going to get tough at some point in your life for everyone, no matter what you choose to do. But when it gets tough, if you back down and shy away, then, like, all the problems in the world will just persist. If anything, they'll get worse, right? And Canadians have done that for so long. We've put so much trust and faith into our politicians and our public officials that, like, it's like we've had our head in the sand, right? And then we start paying attention and you start uncovering corrupt practices, and then it gets overwhelming and people just say, oh, I can't take it. I have to stop listening now, right? I have to stop reading the news because it's so depressing. But once we stop, it just gets worse. Like, it just gets worse and worse. So I guess for me, it's like, I know I'm making a change, even if it's just to the changes I already made to the laws in Canada. But at this point, like, honestly, what's keeping me going is almost a morbid curiosity, because at this point, I think, how long are they going to do this? And then I wonder, how many different ways can the system deny me access to justice? I've been denied everywhere else. Now I'm stuck in front of a labor arbitrator. And even this process has been a total, like, it is an eye opener for me, right? Because I have the Court of Appeal telling me that a labor arbitrator is the expert who should be deciding this matter. And
Yeah.
then I go before the expert, and at our last hearing, he was actually hostile towards me, telling me that my complaint was too long, it was too many pages. He couldn't find the
So many
information I
words.
was referencing. Right. I mean, I'm trying to take a 7-year battle and compress it into
Yeah.
one complaint. It was about 46 pages long. Well, he didn't like that. So, this is the only thing I'm left with now. I have a lawyer who's been hired as an arbitrator dealing with the police lawyer and the association lawyer, and then me, self-represented me, right? So in that environment, as I've learned, I don't get as much deference because I'm not a lawyer. So anytime there's a disagreement between me and the lawyer, whose opinion gets put in writing, it's the lawyer's, right? So I lose so many arguments just because I'm not a lawyer. It doesn't matter if my argument has merit, or if it can be tested and pass the test. I just get, there's been so many decisions published in our case. And that's what really turns my stomach, is reading a published legal decision, but knowing that there's things in the decision that aren't true, things that are exaggerated. Sometimes they're written in a way to make me look like I didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a differentiation between, she's not a lawyer, but this lawyer told us that this is all accurate and this is all true and this is what we believe. So
Yeah.
this is what I've been up against for 7 years. At this point, I'm happy you asked when you did to do this podcast, because I want people, if they're really wondering, like, how can this sort of thing happen? My hearings are all public, and September 20th is the hearing where the police lawyer is trying to have all of the evidence that I'm going to present to show the true intent of my resignation agreement. He's trying to have it all thrown out and say that it's inadmissible. And I'm going to be arguing that it's 100% admissible because it's proof of fraud. And anytime you allege fraud, you can't claim settlement privilege if I'm saying that it proves that you've been acting fraudulently since 2017.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting because, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I might make all the right arguments and I may still lose. But the more that I can get people from the general public to watch, the more they know there's extra eyes watching what they do.
Yeah.
Because these kind of things happen in this tiny little bubble, right? Where nobody watches. They're not broadcast.
Yes.
They're typically not public. They're not recorded. If I wanted it recorded, I'd have to pay the court reporter myself. So it's these kind of things that are happening across the country that if we start to pay attention to, then we can speak about them from an informed perspective. People can start to say there is no access to justice in policing. Like when and I know I was a police officer, but I've connected with enough citizens to know that, like, even when somebody is killed in your family by the police, you're still not treated very well. And you still don't have access to these oversight bodies. Like, I know families that have been pleading with the different oversight bodies for better accountability, better oversight, and they're up against the same battle that I'm up against. It's that we have this reluctance to accept that there's misconduct at the highest levels in policing. And I've witnessed it from other officers in the past 7 years. I have a lot of people that reach out to me now and tell me their story and, show me their evidence. And I know enough to know that it's incestuous. There is a lot of abuse of power happening within police leadership. Some of it's hitting the light of day. There's an officer in Durham named Nicole Whiteway, and she filed a lawsuit against, I believe it was Durham Regional Police, with some officers named throughout. But her lawsuit, it's, when you read it, it reads like a soap opera. Like, it has people that were, not making arrests when they should have, almost bribing people about, well, you give me information and I'll do this for you, or threatening misconduct charges if they don't provide information. But, her case is the first case that passed the test from a female officer perspective. She passed the test where the court said, you know what, we're not going to force you back to an arbitrator. We're going to allow you to proceed in court. That's the first time that a decision like that has been rendered for a female police officer. And right now, she is slated to have her day in court where these accusations are going to be challenged. And, everybody needs to pay attention, because I know for a fact that the things going on in Durham are happening across Ontario. It's just that, like, it depends on who the chief is, how connected they are. Maybe it has to do with in-house counsel and how connected they are. And there are certain people in Ontario policing that just seem to be above the law, because the allegations that I know that have been made to these oversight bodies, and then the oversight body will just choose not to investigate at all. It's very, very strange.
Yeah. Not that it really matters, but does that one that's in court, is she representing herself or does she have a lawyer?
No, she has a lawyer. Yeah, and
Okay.
I mean, and I don't want, I want to make sure your listeners know that there was a time early on that I didn't have a lawyer simply because I couldn't afford a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
I'd left my job. I was starting my own business. I was trying to support my 3 kids. I didn't like, when I first started getting the figures that they had spent, it was up over 200,000. And I remember at the time thinking, like, even if I sold my house, I wouldn't have been able to come up with 200,000. I didn't
Yeah.
have that much equity. So
Yeah.
if I had been paying a lawyer, I would have already been bankrupt. So I had to quickly teach myself all about the laws, the
Yeah.
rules of procedure, all that stuff. I did a lot of reading of sample factums and sample appeal books, and I managed to get it all together. And I have, I've had judges say your work is very well put together, but then it's like they don't give me credit for the content, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, thank you, but like give my arguments equal weight. I might be self-represented, but I'm still like a knowledgeable and educated individual.
Yeah, well, and I want to go back to a few things you said, but one too is that you're self-represented and that the courts don't give you a lot of deference. So just for listeners to understand too, that means that they don't the court will not be as flexible, maybe is a good word to use, with Kelly's arguments versus the lawyer's arguments on the other side because he's expected to know more about the law. And because I do a lot of work against the government, and I have a problem with this. And I just recently read a decision here in Alberta of a self-represented person against the provincial government on something similar to what I'm doing. And reading through that decision, like I think number one, you were in a much different position. Like you, right from the start, you want to get informed as much as you can. You had an issue with your own personal experience in policing. And what did you do? You got informed. You actually became a police officer. So, like, it's incredible. I want people to help to understand that. You want to get involved. That's great. But understand the basics. It's so good. It's available. Sometimes it's hard, but it's there. And that's so important. I have a problem when people are self-represented going up against the government and or their union who they themselves are paying for. I personally, morally, have an issue with this. So I was reading this decision, and in that case, the self-represented person, I don't think was as sophisticated as you. And I feel that the government in that case was like high-fiving itself for its win. And to me, I'm thinking this is a win against, like, this is not an apples to apples comparison. You should not be congratulating yourself on that because this person was in a vulnerable position, and maybe not vulnerable is right, but they're in a position that's different than you, and they're paying, you are the government.
Yeah.
You have resources more than any person, any one individual citizen. It's a huge David and Goliath. Even that, like at least, that's kind of how I feel some of the work that I do. But at least I have the legal education. But on the self-represented, so I have a hard time hearing that you didn't get deference because often in cases where it's like, let's say tenancy dispute. This happens a lot when one of the parties is not represented, especially if it's the landlord, he has a lawyer, and the tenant is self-represented. Generally, you would see the judge giving deference to the tenant because he's in a vulnerable position. That should be exaggerated when it's the government. That should be exaggerated when it's your union that you paid for. That's going after you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I'm trying to really trigger the public interest aspect of my case. I've been lobbying reporters and everything saying like, because a lot of people want to say, well, Kelly, you started all this, you filed your lawsuit against them. Yeah, I did, because I was in a position where I was going across the country advocating for better accountability and transparency in policing. And then the very people I was, I had experienced were still acting in a way as if they were above the law. They were still doing things that I was like, that's a blatant violation of my agreement. How can you do this? Right.
On our dime.
So my lawsuit was just saying, like, I'm still watching you and you still have to abide by the law. And I only filed my initial lawsuit for $200,000. So if they were a corporation, would their board of directors be allowing them to spend $700,000 fighting a $200,000 lawsuit? Right? Like at some point, a public body should have strict guidelines on how they spend money defending lawsuits because, you know, and in my case, it wasn't just a matter of them defending themselves against me, the big Goliath. It was that they filed their case again. They went on the offensive, right? And I don't know if, are you familiar with the term DARVO?
No.
So DARVO is an acronym. It's deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And it happens all the time in whistleblower cases where, you know, the whistleblower calls out something. Hey, I see you doing something, it's wrong. And they'll incorporate DARVO. They'll right away deny we're not responsible for any of this. Then they'll attack the whistleblower and reverse victim and offender. So, you know, they've successfully made me look like I'm the bad guy. I was the one that this whole time, you know, I think their wording is my blatant and repeated violations of my resignation agreement. Okay, well, that sounds pretty bad, right?
That makes you like such a bad person.
Yeah. And they're asking,
gosh,
you know,
Kelly,
they're asking
how dare
for
you violate the agreement.
They want me to pay them significant damages to remedy the harm to their reputation. Essentially, they
misconduct of your work.
Yeah, essentially, they filed a defamation claim at the Human Rights Tribunal. That's essentially what they did. Because when you read through it, they talk about all these things I'm saying and how it hurts their reputation. And I'm thinking, and that was one of my arguments was the Human Rights Tribunal does not have jurisdiction over defamation claims, but they've allowed it to persist.
That or what I didn't realize it went to the defamation, but to me it was strange that if it's a breach of contract, that should be in court, not in a Human Rights Commission. So that's what was a bit strange, but I haven't read it all. I do want to touch on too, you said transparency, and I think this is crucial. I think that this is so incredibly important. I think your strategy and your thinking is excellent, is we need people's eyes on these things because the more we inform people, the more important. And it goes to, you said about politicians, you mentioned corrupt, which like you could see it, and I can't remember what it was related to, but what I wanted to highlight too is when you talked to the Minister of Justice, I think in Ontario, and he didn't know about this at all.
So, well, yeah, so in Ontario, we have an Attorney General and Solicitor General.
Right.
Who are both highly involved in policing. They have never, only once was I ever invited to go speak to somebody in the Solicitor General's office. And when I did, I presented them with all my information. That was prior to the rewrite of the laws. Since then, I don't get anything. I get their cookie cutter responses that every other person gets. I don't get any individual responses. I don't get any, you know, they won't get involved. They won't investigate the things that I'm bringing to their attention. I think I'm pretty much on a blacklist for all these different organizations. I don't have support of any, you know, you look at like, we have a Police Association of Ontario. You think that they would be supportive of people like me who are trying to make a difference in policing that would help every police officer across Ontario, but I don't have any of their support. So like policing is very like cannibalistic, right? And I think I was thinking about this today. That might be the subject of my next book because, you know, people that are in policing, they kind of believe that they know what it's like. A lot of people get out because they see how it is and they're just like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. People getting in are given the rose-colored glasses. It's going to be great. You're going to make a lot of money. You're going to have a guaranteed pension. You know, you're going to be protected if anything happens. The union has your back. So there's all these different aspects to it. But once you actually get in, you realize like it is totally cannibalistic because when things really get bad, nobody really does have your back. Like, unless you know, you have to be somebody that can really shove down like that moral, I call it like the moral gut feeling, like, because when you start to feel sick about an issue, it usually means it's unethical or it's immoral, you know, because you can't really say right or wrong because some things could be wrong, but really it's like, it's sort of a right thing because everyone does it. There's no consequence. But when you get that gut feeling, you know, like this is fundamentally wrong. And I don't know what it takes to be a human being and be able to suppress that feeling because for me, I just wasn't able to.
I'm the same. I'm very
Apparently
much
lots
the
of
same.
people can, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not good at that. What I was getting at with the politician is just highlighting that the one minister that you did speak to wasn't aware that you weren't. So when the change happened, before that change happened, he wasn't aware that you couldn't make a complaint at all against your chief. And so what I was trying to highlight too, and I want people to go away with often, is that we often look up to our elected officials and leaders thinking that they know everything about all this stuff. And the day before they were elected, they could have been just like you and I, understanding our area of understanding and expertise and life experience. And then the next day they're elected and they're expected to know everything. And I think we have to recognize that that might be a little bit much.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I think that there's a massive disconnect and understanding in a lot of issues generally in the public. And I think public officials must take the time to learn about these things if they're going to be representing
Yep.
people. So I think there's an obligation both on citizens and elected officials. But it was just interesting to hear, like, and I want to remind people that we all need to get educated first in order to improve things because
Yeah.
we don't all know things. So that's why engaging and being informed is so important.
Yeah, that's what I love about your podcast
Yeah.
because, these are things that if you're a tax-paying citizen, you should understand how this all works. And
Yeah.
the one thing that you just touched on, excuse me, the one thing I do have a problem with is how much lobbying is done in Ontario. I can't speak to BC, but in Ontario, our Ontario Association Chiefs of Police and the Police Association of Ontario are extremely, you know, I guess successful lobbying groups.
Yeah.
So when there is, when you have that politician that gets put in that position of, say, Solicitor General, they're going to oversee police services in Ontario. Like you said, they could have come from an education in, who knows, industry or whatever. They get put in that position, even if they were a lawyer, right? To me, that doesn't mean you know anything about policing. But
Not at all.
they get put in that position, and who are the ones that are teaching them the ways of the world? They're
Right.
former chiefs.
Yeah.
They're retired chiefs, they're retired deputy chiefs, they're senior officers that are teaching the politician how to do their job. And then it just perpetuates. We end up with laws that are written to give police chiefs tremendous power and autonomy. They don't have to answer to anyone. But when you
Yeah.
start going back and wonder, like, well, this is why we have this, because you're only listening to two sides of, a multi-sided story. Like the politicians typically don't want to sit with advocates, right, and hear about the advocate's experience with policing. They want to say to the chief, well, chief, tell me how it really is, right? You're, like you said, you're the expert. You've been doing this for 30 years.
Yeah.
You know the truth. So you tell me how it is. You tell me how
Yeah.
I should react to the situation. And that's why some of these problems are perpetual. Because these, a lot of times the people that get appointed to work in the Solicitor General's office, like the assistant deputy, the deputy minister, they come from police services. They're senior members that retire that have connections in government, and they just seamlessly walk into a job with government, having just as much influence with when we haven't even talked about the problems, right? There's never been a review of, well, how successful was that person in their leadership role within their police service? We have no way of tracking that because,
Yeah.
Historically, someone like me wasn't able to complain about them. So
Yeah.
I know, like, because I've written a couple books now and I've spoken to a lot of people, I know that there is a systemic problem with police leaders abusing their power, 100%. And our
Yeah.
government does not want to look into it. They don't want to uncover it. I've actually been told that they're afraid that the problem is so big that by looking into the problem, it's going to create a loss of trust in policing with the public.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's almost like, are you not reading the headlines in the newspapers? Like,
Yeah.
there's already a decline of trust. And the decline of trust is usually because when someone does come public with something, everybody kind of says, well, how was that allowed to persist behind closed doors if we had proper oversight and accountability? So it exposes everything, right? The fact that we don't have oversight or accountability, it's just not
Yeah.
there. Because when you have a really egregious allegation, nobody wants to look into it. They're all just passing the hot potato to each other. You know,
Yeah.
OPP doesn't
No,
want it. We'll check the RCMP. Oh, they don't want it. Like nobody wants to be the one to step in and critically look at a comrade, right? They just
yeah.
don't. Because that
Yeah.
ruins your, like, if you were to do that, you're ruined, right? You're
Yeah.
completely ruined for the rest of your career.
Well, just because that's how it's set up. But yeah, to me, it's just laughable that that would be even the suggestion or the reason not to look into these because it's so obvious. Like you said, you see it on headlines. Things are exposed, especially now in this day and age. And maybe this is why censorship is like the number one discussion in government right now, at least federally. But it's so obvious. And I think that the more they expose themselves, and I've been talking about this a little bit more, I think is better now. Like keep digging yourself into the hole. The public, while not incredibly informed on certain things, can really tell reality from not reality. And you keep telling people that everything is okay while they can see everything is not okay. You're exposing yourself. So
Yeah.
go ahead. I
I
feel,
do, I agree with you. I think it's getting harder and harder to, well, I agree with you that, you know, humans can decipher reality from fiction, but I mean, we have people in these extremely high positions of authority. Like when I
yeah,
talk about police chiefs, right? Like their power is, it's almost a physiologically crippling power. Because when people know someone is a chief of police and they enter a room, right? There's like this, like, right? The chief is here. Like, even if you're not a police officer, it's pretty intimidating. Like, this guy runs the whole show. And I mean, if you upset the guy that runs the whole show, like, there's a lot that can happen to you. Like, sometimes it's like sneaky retaliation. Sometimes it's just, you know, if you're a reporter and you write a damning story about a chief, well, the chief's not going to call you the next time there's a news story, right? Or if you're a politician that butts heads with the police, well, maybe you start getting pulled over more often, just getting
yeah,
harassed daily. Like there can be so many things that happen that most people just want to stay on the good side, right? Stay on the
yeah,
good side. Don't upset them because this could go wrong for me. But ultimately, it's like at some point, if we start to look at what's actually been tolerated, and I do
yeah,
use the word corruption openly because I know of enough cases of corrupt practices, whether that's nepotism, cronyism, favoritism. Like when an allegation gets made against a cop and they choose not to investigate it, that's favoritism because they swore an oath that they had to enforce the laws objectively and impartially. It didn't give them the choice to choose when to or when not to enforce the law. It has to be objective and impartial. So it's that kind of discretion that I think has been abused for probably a long time. But the benefit now is that using devices like cell phones or email or video, we're able to, you know, that's the kind of thing I'm happy that is happening because there's some truths that you can't deny, right?
yeah,
And even in my case, they've been running with this narrative since 2018 that I'm blatantly and flagrantly violating my agreement. Well, I'm getting really close to the point in time where the evidence is going to be put before a public hearing, right? Because before now they've been successful at keeping everything, it's on file, but we're not going to have a hearing. We're not going to let you speak. We're just going to keep it all suppressed. But this will be the first time in a public hearing where I'm able to say,
yeah,
well, this is the evidence. It proves that you've been proceeding fraudulently since 2018 at the expense to the public of over $700,000. Like at some
yeah,
point, you'll have to answer to that. And
yeah,
that's why, like, I think part of the reason that I keep going is because the longer this goes on, I feel like I'm finally getting my credibility back, right?
yeah,
Because in 2018, they did everything they could to steal that from me. But, you know, people they have to have enough common sense to think that if what I was doing had no basis and I was the one that was frivolous, they would have been able to shut me down a long time ago,
yeah,
right? We wouldn't be here 6 years later still in this legal battle. So at
yeah,
some point, I'm going to be given some credibility just by persevering and getting to this point. They can keep denying me access to justice, but at some point, someone's going to have to listen to me, and then all of this is going to be heard in a public hearing. And that's really all I want, is I just want to know that, I guess part of it is I need to restore a bit of faith in my heart, is that do we actually have a justice system in Canada? That's the answer I'm asking of our system. I potentially this year or next year, I might get that answer, but they have continued to deny me, you know, deny, deny, deny. It's like at some point, someone has to listen to me because if not, then we don't have a democracy. Like I feel like I'm trying to prove, do we still have a democracy or not? because all I've
Well,
experienced is the opposite.
I'd say rule of law in your case, just whether or not anyone's above the law. Were you ever concerned about your own safety throughout all of this?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I've probably been blissfully ignorant as a defense mechanism to stop me from like a full-blown mental breakdown because, part of PTSD is paranoia and you start to get like sometimes it's not warranted, but I have pushed out the paranoia thoughts so much that when something does happen that is blatantly like for at one point my business email was being hacked and even the company that insured me this was safe email couldn't find a hack, but like so many weird things were happening with it.
Yeah.
At one point, I think my home was even being broken into. But, at this point, I have cameras everywhere. I drive with a dash cam. Like I'm doing what
Yeah.
I can to keep myself safe. I'm actually worried after this September hearing of what would happen to me because it's the focus is now shifting to their lawyer, who's a Bay Street lawyer in Toronto with a big firm who's got lots of resources. That does scare me because maybe Waterloo didn't have the guts to take things farther, but I don't want to be the next Boeing suicide, put it that way.
Yeah, I have, that's where I have faith in lawyers. So I don't know why on that kind of aspect, but, and hopefully that's not even an issue or the case where it goes. But um, amazing story, Kelly, obviously. Um, really, I think if you just peel everything back, is you saw there was a wrong a long time ago, and you've been trying to do something to address it. And what happened in the face of that is you were challenged even more throughout it.
Yeah, and that's it, Eva. Like initially, like I love that we're here at this point in time because I can go back and say the thing I spoke out about was discretionary enforcement of domestic violence laws when it involved an officer. That was it, period. And if
Yeah.
anyone wants to challenge me on that issue and say that that's not an important issue, it's not a matter of public interest, I would take that debate in a heartbeat. Even if it was my former chief, I would love to talk to him about that because I guarantee he has zero experience with domestic violence. But it has metamorphosized into this thing now that is just like, what is this? Right?
Yeah.
Why are we still in this? Is it ego driven? Like, I'd be ready to walk away, but I can't walk away from a case they brought against me.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm
And
still in this battle.
the issue is just so serious. Like, this is not something you disregard, domestic violence against women by police officers. Like, let's get to the bottom of it. This is an issue that you don't just throw aside.
And if everything was working as it was intended to work, then even a full inquiry would expose that everything is happening fine. And,
Yeah.
maybe Kelly was misinformed or maybe she didn't know right from wrong at the time, prove me wrong. Like I've been saying
Yeah.
that to them since 2016, prove me wrong. But if you can't, then why am I the one that's still facing some kind of retaliation when I was just the one that spoke it, right? Like I had
Yeah.
nothing to do with it. I wasn't the investigator. I wasn't the victim. I was not personally involved. I just called it out because I
Yeah.
knew it needed to change. Like I do have fears that my daughters will grow up and be in a world where they have to fear certain people because even if they break the law and they report them, they might not be held accountable. So they shouldn't get involved with those kinds of people. Like we don't live in a third world country. We live in Canada. And I'm just trying to
Exactly.
bring that back, right? Like
Yeah.
Canada we should be able to depend on our police, not be
Yeah.
worried that they're above the law and they won't be held accountable.
Yeah, totally agree. That was so great, Kelly. Unless there's anything else, let everyone know where they can find you and maybe a little bit about your book as well, because you have one more maybe coming, but what do you have already out?
Yeah, I published my book initially in 2020 because at that point I had just won at the Court of Appeal and that was when they went back and revisited the motion and that was the turning point where I knew like this is just going to be a perpetual carousel. I'm going to go around and around and around. It's never going to really end. So I thought this is the time to put the book out. I've since filed 2 separate revisions. So there's now a 3rd edition, and it's called Police Line Do Not Cross, Silencing a Canadian Police Whistleblower. And I thought that it was the right time to do that because I wanted people to know like what my mindset was getting into policing, what it was that I saw that I wasn't comfortable with. So I do actually put some of the real evidence in there. It's all anonymized, but I wanted people to see what I saw and know that
Yeah.
like any person's going to read that and go, oh, like that's really bad, and to
Mm-hmm.
know that this person's a cop and they're carrying a gun and, so I put enough in there for people to know, like, this is what I knew and this is why I felt so compelled to do something about it. But then it's in great detail of everything that happened after that. And
Mm-hmm.
it's available on Amazon. I have it on my website, and my website is police-whistleblower.ca. So it's police-whistleblower.ca. And that details everything in my case. And I put that together last year because, again, like I had reached this point where I knew that like they were successfully controlling the narrative by making sure that this just goes on forever. Because eventually
Mm-hmm.
people lose interest. Nobody wants to follow up on my story. The reporters get bored because they think it's still going on, right? Like nobody really knows what's going on. And I still 100% believe that everything to do with my case is a matter of public interest and should be made transparent because they're paying, like you said, public dollars to do all this. So if
Yeah.
anything they're doing, I'm exposing and someone says, oh, that's wrong, then the board that's spending this money should be held accountable.
Yeah.
So it's all up there. I put every published decision. I have a mailing list that, I send out details of how people can observe my future hearings. I try to stay as connected as I can, but that this is the summer and I have a little bit of downtime because my hearings don't resume till September. This is kind of the only time that I can come up for a breath of fresh air and try to regain a certain sense of normalcy in my life. So I'm not great at responding to emails, but I always do eventually respond. It just might take me time in the summer because I'm trying to regain some health.
Well, thank you, Kelly. That was really amazing. And I wish you luck with everything. I kind of don't feel like you need it. It's like in your spirit, in your nature. You're just going to keep going. And I
Well,
think that's what I think it's great for people to hear that too. Like everyone can make a difference in
yeah.
your own area, just even a little bit. If we all just do one thing, then we're already affecting a massive change. So
Yeah, and
well
it's
done.
it's knowing in you, right? Like I know that you know in yourself that you're doing something that
Yeah.
is making a difference just having these discussions because
Yes.
so many people want to shy away for like not sit and talk to somebody unless they agree with everything they agree with and
Yeah.
and a lot of things I love challenging other people on their beliefs and I love being challenged on my
Yes.
beliefs because it gives us a chance to talk about them, as
Yes.
long as you stay respectful, which most of us do. I come out of those conversations always knowing more than I did in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and I like to think about it. I know a little bit about the world, and I'm always interested in learning more. We're just such a small being in this massive planet. Who is expected to know everything, and why would you want to pretend
Exactly.
you know everything? So yeah, no, that was lovely. I think I might have forgotten to mention to you that I do a few more minutes with the paid Twitter subscribers. So if you
Okay.
don't mind, we'll just cut here.
Sure.
And then we'll keep going. So I'll thank you again. Lovely. And I hope we hear from you yet.
For sure. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you.